Bonnie, welcome on the Evolve Move Play podcast. It's a pleasure to speak with you. I don't think we've really had a conversation since Respond Project, which was what, summer of 2021?
Yeah, just a couple of like little snippets back and forth, I think, right after. We had that long road trip
Yeah,
down to Massachusetts. That was fun, but yeah.
yeah. You've been
Really,
on my mind though. I thought that was, there was something really rich in particular about the connection with you at that event. So for folks who don't know, the Respond Project was a event organized really around John Vervaeke's work about how we could kind of create a responsible response to the meaning crisis and the cultivation of wisdom that our culture needs.
yeah.
Um, so before we get started, could you introduce yourself a little bit to the audience so people know a little bit about your background? Your background's quite interesting and unique in the way that you've combined entrepreneurialism and working class aspects of life with a pretty intensive career in philosophy. So can you share a little bit
Yeah,
about that with people?
it's one of those like real non-linear kind of histories that I can try to make sense, but it didn't really actually just unfolded the way it did. I grew up in a factory town in Northwest Connecticut. And like my mom worked as a telephone operator in the time when you had to, take the things out and put it in. And my father worked in a factory. I was the first person in my family for all generations to go to college. And I went to college at Colby College in Waterville, Maine. And that was a real big event for me because until it's a residential college, and I'd never slept over at a friend's house or anything like that. Like it was my first overnight stay without my family. So like I went from being very parochial and working class to being exposed to something that was extremely different for me. And of course, it's a liberal arts college, and most of the student body had all been to prep schools, and I didn't know what prep schools were. And the whole kind of social scene there was very new to me, like a puzzle to be solved. I had graduated from high school both as valedictorian and senior athlete of the year, which was the first time a female was awarded that. So I had like these two sides to me, myself, and I had a certain amount of skill, but this kind of new social encounter was extremely provocative to me and extremely difficult for me. And I grew up relative to the people that I got to know there, I realized I grew up like a wild thing. Like my sister and I would fight, and my father and I would play baseball, and he'd throw, he would be the pitcher and I'd be the catcher. And when we were done, I'd have like a bleeding hand, and we used to play slap fight, and I had a BB gun. And so I go into this liberal arts college where people have been to prep school and they're playing their own game, like they have it, but I don't understand that. And I come in as like this wild thing. And yeah, so but I did very well in college. I majored in both philosophy and biology. And I ended up getting a National Science Foundation grant to work first at Princeton and then at UC Berkeley in neuroscience. And that was when neuroscience was just getting started. Eric Kandel, if people know that, I was part of, not his lab, but associated with that. But I spent a year, almost a year in his lab. And I was riding my bike up to Berkeley from Oakland every day. And one day I got into the lab late, and there was a postdoc there. And I remember I had my motor baton on my shoulder, and I was like, I'm sorry, I'm late, but I went to this concert last night and I got up late. And he said to me, he's like, wow, I wish I could still go to concerts. And then I had this like extremely like transformative experience. All of a sudden, I was him sitting in the chair, looking at a young post graduate student and saying, wow, I wish I could do that. Like I had this like out of body experience where I was transported into time. And then it was so powerful that I walked out and I never went back, because like he was really, really good. He's a really good scientist. And yet he was just spending all his time doing science. And I had this very powerful, you don't fuck with when reality tells you something in that kind of a powerful mode, you don't ask questions, right? So but I still had this philosophy background. And so I went to UC, California State University in philosophy. I was getting a PhD in philosophy. And I was, my thesis was in philosophy of science. And I wanted to prove that the speed of light was not constant, but it was perspectival.
Mm.
And this was like really crazy, and I didn't have enough skill, enough capacity, enough math and physics in my background to pull it off. So basically I failed and just kind of left that program due to failure. And then I ended up rooming with people, young people like myself, who were at attending the San Francisco Art Institute. And then my whole life changed again, and I spent many years working with an artist. We had a studio down, I can't remember what the street was. I want to say Market Street. We ended up building these interactive sculptures that we sold to Epcot Center. And then we took that money and we moved to New York and started a studio. And then another turn happened in the sense that I realized that that whole scene didn't align with my personality. And I ended up coming to terms with the fact that like I didn't have a career, I didn't have any skills, I didn't know, I thought I would be a homeless person. And so I started a small company with a woman. I was like, what do I like? I like plants, because I used to do a lot of horticulture and ecology. And we started a company. It was at that time where you'd walk around New York and the lobbies of buildings would be these huge atriums. And we started a company to provide those services, the plants.
How old
and
were
those
you
services.
and what
So
time?
then I was about 23 or 25, I think more like 25.
25, and what era was that be?
That was in, so 25, 50, 82.
82. Oh, that's the era
82.
before.
Yeah. I lived downtown with my artist friend, which would eventually become Tribeca and a loft. A lot of these like kind of urban legends that persist today. I lived a lot of those. We sold a piece to Andy Warhol, Studio 52. All of those things. I mean, I wasn't really entrenched because I was always this kind of like a piece of this, a piece of that. I never became a philosopher. I never became, yeah. But then I started a long business, a long career, 33 years, and first in urban plantscaping. And then I moved out to the country here and started a company, a landscape design build company. And again, both these companies were like startups. We made things up by ourselves. I can remember when in New York City, when they invented the fax machine, I was like, wow, this is going to change life as we know it. And then we got PCs. And then, I trained myself on PCs, and then I created a job costing and estimating and design system out here in the country for large landscape projects. And yeah, so none of that is me today. So then the recession hit, and we were doing about 11 or 12 million dollars of high-end landscaping. Our clients were like Henry Kissinger and Scott Rudin and Oscar de la Renta. And when the recession hit, a lot of this activity, a lot of this landscaping was driven by the housing bubble. And so our company contracted like all overnight. And my job was to get the company so that they wouldn't lose money anymore. And then I kind of took early retirement with a severance because I didn't want to do like simple landscaping anymore. So all along I've been reading and philosophizing. I've been also very active in the Tai Chi community. I was the president of the National Qigong Association for several years. I was competing in 100-mile endurance races on my horse. So all these part of my lives were all going on at the same time. Then the recession hit, and I thought I had been running an online course called the Magellan courses for no money. And then I didn't really want to do another online course because I was really starving for, to have something local. So I went to the Graduate Institute, and I wanted to be like a subcontractor teacher. And they said, because I didn't have an advanced degree, and so they said, well, if you teach the consciousness studies and transformational program, we'll pay you and we'll give you your master's after 2 years.
Okay.
So I had enough like street credit, I was writing for integral theory conferences and stuff like that, that they offered me that. And then I taught that program until COVID kind of killed that school. And then now I've moved on to teaching online at what I call a pop-up school. So I don't know, you see, doesn't really make sense. But my point is that all these kind of potentials were all happening all at the same time. It's not like I did this and that didn't work and then I did this. I was always doing a lot of stuff. And I'll just tell you one funny story. So I also, in the meantime, was doing organizational workshops primarily in Europe. And one day I was introduced by someone at this tech company, and they're like, "This is Bonnitta Roy," and the person said, "I just went on the web to get her biography because I'm like, how many people have the name Bonnitta Roy?" And then he said, "But I couldn't figure out which one she was because one was a horse trainer and one was this." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's like, they're all me." So yeah, thanks for letting me go on and on.
Yeah,
Just to give you a sense.
I think it's such an interesting story, and it resonates with me. Not, I haven't sort of spread myself quite as much across those things, but I think that that aspect of having like a strong working class root and the kind of cultural confusion in entering the world of higher education and people who I think of them as the gentry, kind of the cultural contrast between the gentry and the working class is something that really resonates with me. And then also that combination of love for nature and embodiment and athleticism, and then how all that relates to philosophy. And I think that's what we bonded about a lot at the Respond Project, was that in the kind of general conversation around sense making and wisdom and self-cultivation and responses to the meta crisis, I think both of us have the sense that the body and nature are really undervalued.
At work.
There's a lot of head nodding to it, but it doesn't seem like a lot of the people have really gone deep enough into it to sense how fundamental it is.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to start kind of my questions. I don't have a lot of questions for you. I think it's just going to kind of unfold. But I figured I'd start with the question that was sort of present at the Respond project. I guess there's kind of two axes. Jordan Peterson said something I found really fascinating once. He said, the answer to the corruption of society is the virtue of the individual. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that, and it's also incomplete. I think that we can think of them as two axes, that that there's no level of virtue you can cultivate meaningfully in a large group of people that's going to be sufficient to overcome a truly corrupt incentive structure. And so you have to shift the incentive structures and institutions. And that's where I see like Zach Stein and Daniel Schmachtenberger and folks like that are really dialed into what are the type of institutional changes that could afford what we need to do? But then the flip side is that it really doesn't matter how virtuous the institutions are if the individuals become broken in their virtue. And so I think we face a kind of erosion along both fronts. And I see my work and some of this, and I really, I think your work as well, as kind of existing in the pole of how do we deal with creating virtuous individuals. So the question I had for you is like, how do we create the type of individuals who can solve the problems that we currently have, the meta crisis, to use Schmachtenberger's term?
Yeah, so I would agree with you in terms of most of my work is on the individual level.
Mm-hmm.
But before we get into that, there's a caveat here. So this is also where you said it's incomplete. And I'm going to, I don't want to say the things everybody already knows. So I'll say something a little provocative. And that is, before the individual begins a path of becoming a virtuous individual or a leader, it is important to understand how embedded we are and grateful to be embedded in conventional reality. In other words, if you and I had to go out and, the way we get our food, we live in a comfortable place, we have access, we read books, all of this depends upon many, many people being conventional to the system we have today. This is an enormous privilege. So this is like the blue collar worker in me talking.
Yeah.
I used to do retreats here, and my husband would get up at like 2 a.m. to drive a construction truck.
Mm-hmm.
And some people would be like, can you tell your husband to be quiet? Because they were like meditating. And I would just like, oh, girl, you got your priorities like wrong. So I think yes, the idea is to kind of lead or being a leading edge or to inspire the more of the people at the social scale. But the first thing you have to remember is you're here in this role because many, many people just go to work every day. So we want to transform that, but also really honor it. It becomes our obligation then to try to transform the larger society to whatever resources or innovations we've thought of. So it's so that's, I think, very important, because there is this tendency in my work. I used to say to my students, we're building bodhisattvas one narcissist at a time. Because once you go into the individual, especially in the cultural milieu we have now, where it gets tagged as, there is a sense in which you kind of pull yourself away from the mean. And there is sometimes a phase people do get quite narcissistic, but we want to understand that there's, and you see this all the time. You see geniuses in my community who've lost their jobs, lost their income, lost their apartments, and they literally go insane. So we have to understand that this is operating for us, and that then it becomes our obligation to try to make it work in the larger society. So can you just now repeat right at the end, you had that question, what is the,
Yeah, I think the central question is, how do we orient ourselves such that we could start to develop the kinds of individuals? How do we become the kinds of individuals who can solve the problems that we face? Right, the meaning crisis, the meta crisis, all those, this idea that somehow there's something corroding and breaking down in our society, and there are important historical antecedents to it, and there some kind of new solution needs to come, right? You're talking about the sort of the conventional individual and how much they're the backbone of society, right? And you and I are not conventional individuals.
Right. But on the other hand, they're stuck and they're oppressed by the system and the elites and stuff
Yeah.
like that. So
I was watching your talk about the organization of the self with the Stoa. Our mutual friend Aaron Cantor recommended that as a way to kind of
yeah,
start grappling with your work more in depth. And you were talking about I think you said that kind of at the level of our development, we sort of start with the things that are mine, and then there's
yes,
me and how the me interacts with the world. And you see yourself now and see that your actions then are reflected in other people. And so you have some agency, and that's a kind of adoption of a role.
yes. You lead with your me. You're actually trying to, it's kind of like using yourself as an avatar to get favors from your parents or something. You're aware of yourself as an object for other people. So you're
Mhm.
not an I yet.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have two daughters who are both very beautiful, and they've both been praised since they were young for being very, very beautiful. Um, and that's fine. And I want them to, I don't want them to not recognize that they're beautiful, and I don't want them to not recognize the power intrinsic to their beauty. I want them to celebrate their beauty and feel happy about it, feel grateful and blessed. Um, but I worry about how beauty, in particular for women, can become a trap of leading you to see yourself primarily through the eyes of other people. That your
Yes.
body becomes a object for other people rather than a home for the self.
Yep.
And so my goal with my daughters in particular is not to ignore, suppress, or take anything away from their pursuit of beauty, but to help them see all the other ways in which being an embodied human being is valuable to them
Yeah.
and is central to their identity, so that that aspect doesn't take over.
This one piece alone is huge. Like Instagram is the height of just trying to be a me out there. Um, and um, it's normally a stage people just normally go through. But things like social media and I don't know why these stages have been prolonged. Even adult, people can primarily just lead with their me. So
Yeah.
I think the me stage is actually much more prolonged now than it was. Um, yeah, when I was growing up.
So you mentioned basically before we really even have a sense of the self, we have a sense of the things that are ours, right?
Yeah.
So you're a 1-year-old doesn't really have a sense of how they're perceived by others,
Right.
but you have a sense that this toy is mine.
Mine is the first one, right?
And then
And
there's
that's in the animal realm, right?
yeah,
My bone, my
yeah.
children, yeah.
Then there's this me, which is the adoption of a role or adoption of roles. And then there's the I, which is sort of starting to understand the authentic self. And then there's the we, which is when the self can play well with
Right.
others. Um,
Right.
and then there's us, and we can kind of keep going up. But this me thing, I think, is very interesting. When you're talking about, we're talking about, I guess, those of us who are sort of playing in the I and we space.
Right.
We have to look and realize that that ability to play in that space is girded by all those roles that are being fulfilled, well or poorly, but they're being fulfilled.
Right.
And people are willing to step into them. And that aspect of accepting a role and seeking to play it well.
Yeah. So let's go slowly here. So a child, when they're in the me stage, they play a lot with a lot of different roles.
Mhm.
And then as they move to the I stage, we still have roles. If you're coach of the soccer team, you show up a certain way. If you're also a pastor, you show up a certain way. So there's certain roles that we play, but we don't relate to that role as the me. We're not self-conscious that people are watching us. We're more like, I'm in this role and I'm serving this person, versus the obsession with the me, like what do I look like? So if you're an adult and you have an I and you take a role, you are relating to yourself as the unit of the agency rather than the object for appraisal or approval from the other. You're not getting your cues from other people. You're trying to inhabit this role through the generosity and skill that you have, and then let it be in the world, rather than strategizing this role. Like if you're a pastor and you're virtue signaling, so people think you're a good pastor, that's still a me.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So a way to think about that occurs to me, and I'm curious if this lands for you, is that someone who's kind of developed their eye well still plays many roles, and they're accept the roles and understand the necessity of those roles, but they are able to inhabit the role in a way that's authentic to self.
Right.
Or someone who's still stuck in the me stage is kind of colonized by the roles that they choose to play.
Right. They're
And
faking it until they make it, and making it depends upon whether people recognize them as the role versus the role as a tool by which I'm going to do something in the world, perform something in the world.
So I'm curious about this because there's an interesting ambivalence between. So if we think about the self-actualization of the individual, sometimes people want to find a lot of uniqueness in how they play a role, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And some people are more interested in just the virtue of the role itself, right? I'm going to do this thing well. And in some sense, you were pointing to the individuals who sort of keep society running are more maybe oriented toward just the role, as opposed to the inhabiting of the self within the role.
Right.
And I think that can be virtuous and can be really valuable. But then there's the negative side to that, I think, is what people are seeing now as kind of the NPC phenomenon, where
Right.
you see these kind of mobs on social media who you can predict their political opinions by looking at the color of their hair, and they're adopting a role, the role of a progressive activist or the role of a conservative activist, and that role then becomes it colonizes the individual, and it sort of moves through this we space online that is
Right.
Very unsophisticated, I guess,
Yeah.
is perhaps the word you would use.
But they didn't grow into that role. They adopted it as a social meme or something. Again, it's all about assessing and strategizing your role relative to how does it look for other people. And you don't always get it right, but I think mostly you can tell the difference when, like, for people who adopt woke ideology, you see this a lot in terms of if you actually, I saw something on the internet the other day where this kid said, how can you stand by this author when they were homophobic or something? And the teacher said,
J.K. Rowling, transphobic. Yeah.
Yeah, transphobic. And the teacher said, well, what do you mean? Well, this person did not actually inhabit this idea because of any thought or any familiarity or any kind of experience. They just dropped it in, as an avatar.
Right. Other people feel this way. Do you feel that way? Not when I read it. Yeah.
Yeah. He said, now I feel like a jerk. Well,
doesn't seem transparent to me.
Yeah.
But other people feel like it is, and that's important, right?
Exactly. So that's the me, leading with your me. And of course you get these clusters where everybody's watching everybody else, so there's no even kind of, there's no real we, because everybody's watching everybody else. And so it looks like a unit of agency, but it isn't. It's just kind of like a cancerous massive growth of individuals popping in and out and off of each other. Whereas I define a we as a unit of agency. So you can truly say, if you're on a sports team, we won the game, even if you're just the water carrier or the ball boy or something, and there's a lot more I in that kind of unit of agency that can say we did this. There's a lot more complications in the relationship between the individual unique people and how they make it happen versus this kind of woke cluster or something.
Mhm. So I found that idea of like how we talked about at the Respond Project, we talked about the idea of angels and demons as kind of a useful framing for collective intelligences. And one of the proposals was that an angel is a kind of we intelligence that is moving sort of upwards in complexity, and a demon is this thing that is sort of collapsing its complexity. So it's capturing people and then actually making them less sophisticated. And so we could see Trumpism, QAnon, wokeism as all sort of demons, whereas maybe, hopefully this little corner of the internet or the Vervaeke space, you might see as an angel, right? It's moving people upwards in their complexity and development. So that's an interesting idea you tied in there, but I want to go in a slightly different direction. You can come back and touch on that, but this balance between the how people get stuck in the me, and then one of the things you mentioned, the origins of the self, is the organization of the self, is that as we enter to the I, often it ends up being somewhat narcissistic. And
Yeah.
I was reading something recently in a book called How to Be the Love You Seek, about the idea that people whose whose parents are quite tyrannical or two-faced, or kind of have ego attachment to their child, they'll create children who have a really have very little ability to sense themselves.
Right.
And so they'll really get stuck in their me. And then on the flip side, children who are really neglected by their parents will end up in a sort of hyper individualism.
Yeah.
And that can be quite narcissistic. So, my relationship between myself and my father was quite neglected. And I'm very, very hyper individualistic, and that has definitely sort of had the shadow side of ending up with a little bit of a more narcissistic tendency in some of my relationships. Mm-hmm. Something that I've been working on. So I was curious about adding that lens of how the primary family system impacts the balance between sort of healthy cultivation of this me and I idea.
Yeah. So in the origins series, I talk about this phase. First of all, the idea here is for us to understand all these transformations of the human across time and in different forms, and by understanding them, just like you said about your children, you understand it, then you're not going to go in there and try to change things, but just by understanding it, the way you interact will kind of attract the growth into the next dimension. So when people are, they usually sometimes see that they've been driven by the me. They'll see, yes, my mom, it was always about her. And then I grew up and I made it about what my peer group thought. Now I make it up. I do what I think my husband wants. It's always about how I look in other people's eyes. Then they might get on a path to try to individuate, to become an I. And what I say is people move from the generalized me, in my in-group, what is the generalized me people want to see? And they go a little too far into the idealized I. And that's okay, because you're trying to compare and contrast. So it's actually easier to kind of go way too far than try to make these small adjustments and get confused in the middle. But then people will start to see themselves, and you can probably think of people, they've been trying to be, enlightened. They've been trying to be the best parkour. They spend all their time trying to be this singular, unique best I, and they can actually get trapped in that. And so I call it moving from the generalized we to the idealized I. And that's a phase, and then something else has to relax. So I like this, that's kind of, it can become demonic, right? When you're trying to do the idealized I and you get all these demons, something has to relax and open up. And this is not easy to articulate, but to open up in terms of, the question will be, well, who am I? If I'm no longer the me, and I don't want to chase this I because that kind of seems false. I'm trying to idealize it and make it up. What is my natural state? Like, who am I as a natural state? And of course, that's when you go back to the body and nature. Those questions get answered at this more fundamental level. And then something new comes from that. So yeah.
So, okay. There's you're pointing to the generalized me. Was that the term you used? And then
yeah, the generalized me and the idealized I. So there's like an oscillation, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Then you go too far.
Yeah. I saw this a lot in my childhood, right? I grew up in the hippie counterculture, and there's this, there's so much spiritual bypassing and kind of spiritual narcissism that you see in that community, which really turned me off towards spirituality.
Yeah.
The last couple of years, and finding Vervaeke and this sort of space. So for some reason, it also reminds me of a book I read. So I co-founded a parkour organization when I was 26, I guess, 27, and then became the lead instructor of that organization. Mm-hmm. And I left it. Basically there was a conflict between me and the other co-founder, and we just couldn't get aligned. And he wanted me to step down as the lead instructor, and I didn't want to step down. And eventually I was just like, I'm going to go form my own org and do this other stuff that I've been interested in. And of course, that was a pretty painful experience. And after it, I was like, okay, I'm, I can be upset and angry with everybody else in the org, but there's not really anything I can do about them. But what I can do is I can go in and examine my own behavior and ask, like, what did I do that contributed to the problems that we had? I read a book then called Tribal Leadership, and it has this stage model, right? And the stages are something like, the first stage is, stage one would be, the world is terrible, right? And people who are kind of stuck in stage one believe that, like, there is nothing really good in the world, and so you should just get whatever you can out of it. And this is kind of like criminal gangs. Then stage two is, my life is terrible. And there's people who feel individually oppressed. They can see that things could work for somebody else. They said that most organizations they looked at, most people were sort of stuck in the stage two. And stage three is, I'm great, right? And this is where you see people who are striving, who are trying to push over, who are trying to make something happen, who have developed ambition. But they usually create a lot of conflict in the orgs that they're working with. And in particular, stage threes tend to produce stage twos because they, the I is usually contrasted to the other. So it's, I'm great because, and everyone else sucks. And then there's a we're great stage, which is like where most good organizations come, where you start to understand that it's the we that brings the org into success. And then at the highest level, there's the world is great. And you're just not even worried about anybody else, because we is still defined in relationship to another.
Yeah.
We're great, and this other org is not great. And so I recognize that kind of in my role at Parkour Visions, I had really been kind of at a level 3, and that a lot of the other people in the organization were stuck in that, things are terrible for me personally.
Yeah.
And they felt, a lot of discontent, a lot of self-doubt and imposter syndrome and things like that. And that was where the inherent conflict came. So as I built my next organization, I was really oriented towards, how can I move into that we're great? How can I see everyone who comes into my org, make sure that I feel trust with them, and recognize that the org is always an expression of a whole crew, not any one individual in the crew. Right. And I was starting to see that when I left Parkour Visions, and starting to bring forth the things in the other coaches that I thought really were feeding the community, but it just kind of wasn't seen before things fell apart. So I was curious to hear how that kind of stage model aligns with what you're talking about, and kind of the problems that we face as we try to evolve people from this me orientation towards that I orientation, and then up into the we orientation.
Yeah, so I think that it's important to move from the world sucks, extrinsic uh, causal relationships, to there's something about me that is why my world sucks. The problem is the way you describe it, the people went from the world sucks to I suck versus the world sucks. Oh, there's something about me, my dispositional state, my orientation, my priors, my proclivities, my mental models that creates a certain behavior with the world so that this enactment sucks.
Mhm.
And so when people start to realize it's not about the world, it's about something in like we call it our interiors, it's important that they have a growth mindset, that that there are causal mechanisms in your personality. There's causal mechanisms in, if your dispositional state, you're always a nervous wreck, you can calm your body down. You can learn to see reality for the first time. You can open your awareness to the perspectives of other people. And all of a sudden, the world starts to open up in its complexity. And you slow your thought process down, you slow down your triggers, and you start to see there's a lot more space to work in the world. Before it was like boom boom and then that happened, and then boom boom and then that happened, and now it's like you start to see things slowly unfolding, and where can you step in and where can you pull back and when can you be still and see that it's going to work itself out. And those are all of that. It's really a transformation of perception happens because you're starting to understand and grow and develop your body. Primarily, it's your body, your psyche, and your body, and your affects. And so once you can't solve the complexity of the world or your psyche if you can't enjoy your body, if you can't move your body, if you can't be comfortable in your body. Everything is predicated on having this body be my home, from which then I can start asking questions of the world, from which I can see how my psyche and my emotions rise up. It's the fundamental orienteering point from which all this can open up, and then I can move in and shape and cultivate these various parts of my experience.
That's quite an interesting idea. That it just strikes me, talking about that idea of the body, and obviously this is where I live, and my big passion is this idea that fundamentally the way that we experience the world, the way that we are able to think, all of it is contingent on bodily processes. And we get so stuck in these abstract realms and these verbal realms that we're not recognizing that they don't actually, a lot of times they don't have as much power as
Right.
something that's more embodied. But I don't know why, but for some reason Jordan Peterson's coming up for me a lot in my background thinking as I'm having this conversation. One of the things he says, you're just talking about the idea that the world sucks, and then maybe it's me that sucks.
Right.
And one of Jordan's points that he makes a lot is like when men say, or he mostly speaks to men, but it would be the
That's
same,
fine.
right? If you say, "Oh, women are all terrible," right, and that's why my romantic life sucks. It's like, well, it's a really big step of growth to say, "Hey, maybe I'm showing up in the way that
Right.
prevents me from meeting well with a woman." And I was thinking about, as you were talking, I was thinking about how that relates to how a lot of young men start to develop some empowerment in their relationships with women when they start taking on a fitness practice. They start
Yes.
developing a body. and becoming strong physically and just having self-knowledge, knowing what it's like to be in their body and mapping it. And then it struck me, oh, how much of this stuckness in the we that we have as a in the me that we have as a culture is actually just because people are so physically disembodied and so physically illiterate, right? And yeah, I'm curious for your response to that.
That's an interesting kind of reframe, because one of the things I think that when I was saying why I think that people are in the me stage longer now is because the me stage has become abstract. So when I was growing up, and certainly in my parents' generation, what was the me? It was just my body, me. I just happened to be Bonnie, and I laugh because I've got two left feet or something like that. But the me stage has become, like everything else, more and more abstract. And so you can spend a whole lot more time trying to fashion or perfect your me, because primarily what you're working with are abstractions and avatars and memes. My me is my memes. Whereas when I was growing up, I mean, it was more concrete and simple. Your me was just, how do people see me as an object in space? They see the way I walk, and this guy walks like that, and this person looks like that. And that was primarily your me. And now we have all these options to work on and fashion and imagine all kinds of me's, because it's gotten to be a category that's very abstract.
Yeah, so rather than sort of adopting the walk of the preps or the clothing of the preps, right? You're adopting an entire worldview that you're communicating primarily through, memes and mimetic wars online.
Yeah, there's no end to it. It doesn't exhaust itself like it used to before.
And it
Um,
mutates all the time, right?
it
There's new
mutates all the time, and then it gets all entangled with there's for profit to keep that system going, whereas before there wasn't that much profit. I mean, the earlier versions was fashion, right? So you dressed like your generation did, and that kept the profit of the fashion industry because you could change the styles all the time. But those things are slow moving, and they don't scale the same way that abstract representations of your me do.
This is somewhat random, but I think it's very interesting because you talked about that idea that identity for your generation had a lot to do with fashion. So you had generational identity. People in the 70s dressed differently than people in the 60s and the
Right.
50s. And then you had your sort of clique-based identity. So were you a prep? Were you a jock? Were you a geek? Were you
Right.
a punk? And one thing that I've noticed about the world of kind of the aughts and well, especially getting into the teens and the 2020s now, is that there's a lot less generational identity in the way that people dress. And this, I, I was driving up to my house the other day and I saw a couple of kids on skateboards and they had kind of bleached out orange long hair and they were wearing super baggy jeans and fleece hoodies. And literally every single thing about them looked like it could have come from 1997,
Yeah.
right? It was like the tribal signals of skateboarding. They're not shifting and changing, right? The tribal signals of skateboarding in the 60s and the 80s are completely different. But the tribal signals of skateboarding now are just recycled memes from different skate
Yeah.
cultures that have existed before. And I wonder how much of that has to do with this this investment of identity into really political tribes online or mimetic tribes online. And then the flip side of that is I watched an interview with a bunch of punks from the 80s and they all had different political views. A lot of them were pretty libertarian.
Yeah.
Whereas now, if someone is sort of dressed as a punk,
Yeah.
you know their politics and you know it's left wing, right? And the degree to which we expect political conformity in our romantic partners and in our friendships has ramped up massively over the last 15.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious for your take on how that relates to this. Like fashion is almost dying as a source of,
Yeah.
not completely, but it doesn't, it's not vital in the same way. But the mimetic tribes and the spawning mimetic tribes online is incredibly vibrant, if deeply destructive.
Yeah, this is why I think all these issues are complex, because there's a couple of things going on at the same time that seem like they're pulling in different directions. So yeah, fashion, I'm reminded of what, Zach Stein said, that when it used to be before the internet, that when kids, like, when you're in your teenage years, you want to dress differently than your parents, you start to get this tribal fashion or whatever. But in the past, you would go to the store and it just had conventional clothing. And then you would go home and you do something weird with your clothes, like rip them up, or you'd put, a scarf where it didn't belong or something like that. And so these were very local and imaginative. But now we purchase identity things off the internet, all in one package, like the movie Barbie, right? You purchase Barbie, you purchase her memes, you buy the kinds of clothes she wear, you go to a Barbie store, you watch the Barbie movie, and everything is a whole world. And one of the problems with this is where it gets very confusing, is that what I'm going to say is politically incorrect. So if you have any politically correct audience, you might want to stop and come back in 5 minutes. But there's this illusion today that there's more choice, like more choice in your sexuality, let's say, or more choice in, let's just start the sexuality. But the truth is that there's more categories, but the categories are sliced really thin. So when I was a kid, you were a girl or a boy, right? But there were girls that liked girls, and there were girls that acted just like boys, like really like boys. And then there were really prissy girls. And everybody knew that their life trajectory was going to be a certain way. And there was a certain amount of gossip, but it wasn't really a big deal. And the same with boys, we used to, when boys crossed their legs, we would say that they were, effeminate or something. But the point was, there was only two words, pretty much, or two categories, but there were broad categories, and everyone knew there was a lot going on. Now, there's so many categories, it's I don't know, you need, and they all are a certain package together, so you could be non-binary, but does that, and then you're trans, and then you're, all these things, and they don't just come with a sexual or a gender orientation, they come with the whole script of what it means. It means something in your mind too. So you see people in the same category arguing about, whether that's a real mental attitude for that category or not. And so in reality, you think because you have more categories that there's a wider spectrum, but in reality, the problem is the categories are so thin. So now we take, what does it mean to be a progressive Democrat? The category is so thin. And the problem with the categories is nobody lines up exactly like the category. It reminds me of this story where they were building a new generation of fighter jets, and there were women now in the Air Force that were operating fighter jets, and so they get this design team together and they engineer the ergonomics of the flight deck to be toward the mean. So it's not for the tallest person, it's not for the shortest, it's in the mean. And they had more crashes ever in that plane, and it's because nobody fit the mean.
Mm.
There's the mean doesn't, there's not one single representation of the mean. And this is how we come up with our categories. So nobody feels at home in their categories because the categories are statistically set up. And then this is how Democrats vote. And this is how, and then you say, but nobody fits those categories. So then what happens? You need a new category. You need a new tribe. And then it happens over and over and over again.
Yeah. The differentiation of identity across splitting over more and more and more categories. One of the funny things about what's happening with sex and gender right now is I think it's like over 20% of Gen Z identify as LGBTQ. But if you track actual sexual behavior, how many people have had sex outside of a heterosexual sexual connection? It's gone from like, I think I can't remember the exact statistic, but it was something like 40 years ago, 95% of all sex that had been had in the last, year or 2 years or whatever it was by the participants was heterosexual. And now the number is 92%. So, and then also the total number of sexual encounters has gone down.
Way down. When I was growing up, I mean, this is a long time ago, like in early 20s, 30s, most people would experiment with, heterosexual and homosexual. I mean, there's a stage in which people experimented because how could you really tell, and experimenting is interesting because you understand the basic premise for why you recognize you're one or the other. Some people, are truly pretty much balanced in terms of bisexuality. But if you experiment, you understand the embodied experience of knowing why you're not the other, why you're not a heterosexual or why you're not a homosexual. And this freedom to experiment and still be in the unknown without like what category I'm in, and then I have to, if I have a homosexual relationship, I'll be in this category. I must be that. This is the pressure that people have now, and it's the pressure that young people have trying to figure out what gender they are. Well, you don't know what gender you are when you're early puberty and go, if you really look at it. I remember I hung out when I was a kid with a bunch of boys all the time. And we would ride bicycles. We even had fight club, we would sit around and people would fight. And if somebody got really triggered and it was emotional, we pulled them off. And so I grew up, and during that time, I really thought like you got to a certain age and then you had a choice. If you did more of these things, you would become a boy. And if you did more of these things, you would become a girl, And yeah, I mean, and I think at the time, had I been given the chance, like into my little young intellectual brain, like I probably would have thought, yeah, I want to be a boy. But I am so happy I'm not a boy, because once the thing starts to get on its way and flourish, and the differences start to constellate themselves out, it makes the way you understand the proposition or the question is completely different. And the only way to answer those questions is to let the body naturally go through that period of inquiring about itself. The problem I have with the postmodernists, the woke people, they will say, well, gender is just a social construction. And I say, it's really interesting and really important that more and more young people at younger and younger ages understand that gender is socially constructed. Good for you. But all of them, LGBTQ, they're trans, they're all socially constructed. Now what do you do? Mm-hmm. That's the truth. So now what do you do? And so what you have to do is let the body and its natural processes, which involves development through puberty over time, answer the question.
So obviously we're treading into very controversial ground.
Sorry.
An article on this so I could clarify my thoughts. Yeah. it does connect to what I was hoping to talk to you about, which is, really how we are disconnected from nature and we're disconnected from the body. And this is what's driving a lot of foolishness. And if I put my cards on the table, I think that a lot of what's happening around gender is foolish and really deeply destructive. And it's because of this lack of it, right? If you grew up on a farm, you experience the reality of male and female and the necessity of that for the production of livestock all the time, right? There's no other way to produce new young than a male and a female. And when you live a life that's close to nature, that fundamental binary is represented for you over and over and over again. And then when you are living an embodied existence where you do work and you wrestle and you dance and you do physical things all the time, the distinct constraints and affordances of a male body and a female body are just very, very obvious. And I think that people say gender is socially constructed, and I don't precisely agree, because I think,
Yeah, we have to. So sex is not socially constructed, but gender roles, let's say, is
yeah,
socially constructed. But and
for
we're
the
go ahead and continue.
for a
But we're
reason.
gonna end up saying the same things. But
Okay,
just make
sure.
sure that we're talking
Yeah,
about these.
we might say in slightly different words, but
Yeah, yeah,
what I've tended to not like to use the term gender because I don't think that it's a very useful, scientifically valid concept,
right,
because I don't think that we can separate out perfectly the distinct social roles that any given society offers, how
right,
they relate to underlying temperamental variables, and how they relate to intersubjective, sort of bottom-up social processes, right? If you get a group of women together, or a group of men, or a group of girls, or a group of boys, the aggregate personality of that group is going to be different because of the sex of the members. And then each individual is interacting with that aggregate personality in their homes,
right.
and that's happening automatically, the bottoms up process, right? And so I think people underestimate how much culture is actually bottom up. Children recapitulate fundamental cultural patterns in every generation because they reflect underlying behavioral and personality differences that arise from biology and from physical differences, right?
Yeah, it gets it
Boys,
gets it gets really tricky. I believe that culture is bottom up, but you get children living in completely disembodied reality, and that fact that you just said plays out in a completely different way. I want to say some things before I get canceled. So, having said what I said, nature is completely like off the charts creative, right? So you can see all kinds of sexual acts or attempts in nature. I mean, my female ducks are always having sex together. Of course, they don't make babies and stuff, but in terms of roles and performance, there's all kinds of things that nature tries, and nature tries all kinds of different things with your sexual organs and where they come from and where they go, and so I don't want to say that there's some kind of hard coding binary in nature. There are means, and averages, but nature really does try a lot of different things. Now, one of the things you were saying, and what is true in humans, or has been true for most of our what's relevant to us, is that humans are a species with extreme sexual dimorphism. And this is something we have to understand, because like in hyenas, they're mammals. They look like dogs or wolves or something, but the males are really small, and the females have a lot of testosterone, and they completely like are very aggressive dominators of the whole tribe, and the clitoris is larger than the males penises. So that's what I'm saying, nature can do all kinds of things. There's all kinds of things,
nature does some
but
interesting things, but even in doing those interesting things, it sort of reflects the underlying biology. So if you take, so it's specifically spotted hyenas. Spotted
yeah,
hyenas are the only mammal that doesn't have an external vaginal opening, and it's actually it's evolutionarily, it seems like a bad deal, because the female has to then give birth through this pseudopenis that rips apart, and they have extremely high infant mortality and female mortality. And so yeah, they've effectively created a system where the role that they've effectively evolved a system where the kind of masculine role of being high testosterone, high aggression, high social dominance that you might see in a male lion or a male chimp or a male baboon has happened in the females, and the biology has shifted to allow the female to do that. But she's using the same underlying biological template, the female
Right.
hyena,
Right.
right? It's testosterone that's changing her in that direction.
Right.
And what's interesting, so I think there is a hard-coded binary, which is the gametes. You have male gametes and female gametes,
Right.
and usually organized in a relatively consistent way. Something like hyenas are very, very uncommon, right? You can point out one spotted hyena, but then in the
Right.
mammals you see a much more persistent pattern. And
Right.
one thing you said, which is interesting, was that humans are quite sexually dimorphic, which a lot of times
And
people,
so are hyenas. They're just
yeah,
reversed. And so this then makes this then some species that don't have a lot of sexual dimorphism, so you wouldn't have then the roles they have played historically in their culture being so different.
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
humans are interesting because I think human beings are really interesting because we are extremely dimorphic along some dimensions and uniquely non-dimorphic around other dimensions. Human males are one of the most maternal set of males in all mammals.
Right.
So that in that role, human beings are less dimorphic. But as far as subsistence strategy, human beings probably are the most dimorphic mammal, I believe. Males are basically apex predators, and females are mesopredators and foragers. And in most cultures, they really play quite distinct roles in the
Right.
ecology.
But there's a real question like of for most of our history as hunter-gatherers, size really matters.
Mhm,
So it's not clear that females are foragers because they're more like foragers or because they're smaller.
mhm.
So size, and so I think probably maybe 50-50 equal or, equal
Well, it's not
because
just, yeah, it's not
size,
size.
this is something I learned around the farm, and that is um, like the way you feel about a chihuahua when it's attacking you is much different than the way you feel about a horse who's actually being affectionate but just getting too close to you.
Yeah,
And so I think that we underestimate the amount of projection we have between what a woman is like and what a man is like based upon just this dimorphism of size. I
yeah. I
think
think the
it's
size thing
yeah.
is huge, but it's broader than that because human beings are not that dimorphic by primate standards in just gross body size. Right? We're substantially less dimorphic than gorillas or orangutans or even, I think, chimps. But if you account for body fat percentage, which most, like male chimps are like 1.5% body fat and females are like 3. But human beings are 15 and 30, right? Or
Yeah.
15, 25. And healthy human beings. And that actually accounts for a lot. That when you account for that and you equalize to lean body mass, men are much larger proportion than females.
Yeah, so that's an important part
And
because
then we
they,
have huge upper bodies proportionally
yeah,
and narrower hips, which means that we run faster, we throw harder, right? So the physical performance differences that are relevant to hunting or warfare are really massive in human
yeah,
beings. Um, Throwing power and punching power are essentially completely, there's no overlap in the male and female curve.
yeah,
Strongest females are not as strong at throwing as the weakest males generally.
exactly.
And that
Yeah, so
capacity
it's
is
not
quite,
just size by weight or volume, it's capacity, physical capacity by these other metrics. And in that sense, yeah, that's important for people to understand. So even if you're not into the sex gender, there is something substantial about just this aspect, and it's real even if you don't live in real violent. We don't live in, the West, the wild, wild West. It's still real. It's why, they do a lot of studies. The reason why your dog knows more about you than you know about the psychology of your dog, because it matters more to your dog, because you can pull your dog around, you can slap your dog, the dog depends upon you for food and stuff. And so anyone who is at a lesser power in any kind of risk situation or whenever it matters, the person that has less power will know more about the other person than the other person, because it matters more. You don't need to know about
Yeah.
people who are weak and insignificant, but you need to know a lot about, the slave knew a lot about the master and knew what his tendencies were and whether his left eye would go this way when he lied or not. You watch. And so this is a big part of it.
Yeah. That's why children can be really cunning in manipulation of parents, because they're studying you all the time.
They have to. Their lives depend upon it in a way, yours, not the reverse.
I was thinking about this idea, of how, when we think about the idea of inhabiting the mind of a man or inhabiting the mind of a woman, I think people don't recognize how much that's actually constrained by the body, right? And so I've been thinking a lot about the model of, constraints and affordances that have to do with embodiment and how we don't really account for that. And the example that came to me is my partner and my daughters. They always come to me to remove spiders from the house, right? They always come to me to remove spiders from the house. Now, a spider is not a large thing, and we don't have poisonous spiders where I am. But spiders, I think, are just part of the class of potentially dangerous animals. And there's an inherent sense that it's my role to remove those. I'm more risk tolerant, more physically robust. Literally, if I was to get bitten, I have more blood to dilute the stuff in. And this happens, and we see the subtle way this plays out all the time, because the sound of my voice carries a sense of formidability that a woman's doesn't, right?
Yeah.
Size of my body, the width of my shoulders, the height that I have. So if there's a scary dog or a bear or some animal, the likelihood that just by showing up, I will resolve the situation, without any resort to actually using my physical affordances, is just higher, just because of the implied threat of my being.
And I think part of that gets ritualized, like if you weren't around, they could do that. But it's a way in which the family ritualizes their understanding of these roles. And so it's almost like, well, hopefully we won't have a chance to have a robber in the house and have Rafe have to save us. So let's keep this little agreement going in these kind of more like pretend ways. I'm not saying it's complete pretend, but I think you see that a lot. I know that happens between me and my husband. It'd be like, oh, that's your job, when I could certainly do it. But it's this way of these little ritualized ways of honoring and understanding the different parts of the commitments different people make.
Yeah. So I think this idea that we are foolish in some sense, in a broad way, because we don't I want to back up for a second. I have this idea of a kind of like cultural substructures, things that we do that we don't know are a thing, right? So prior to the invention of video games and helicopter parenting, every kid actually did parkour. Parkour wasn't named, it wasn't an institution, it wasn't a thing that anybody thought that they had to cultivate specifically. But kids just ran, jumped, climbed, and explored things because it was fun, and they did it all the time. And then something happens where our culture decides that, kids are really under threat of being kidnapped, which wasn't actually true. And then we have this new tool, video games, to incapacitate children. and everyone just buys into video games and TV because, you know, you feel like your child is safe when they're inside playing video games and TV. And then the culture adjusts, everyone drives faster in suburban neighborhoods because we don't expect children, and now you're more scared to let your kids outside. And all of a sudden you have now this whole cultural system that's inhibiting children from this type of behavior that nobody realized was actually critical to development, right? And so we just lose it. It just dies. It just gets kind of shattered. But then we don't realize what we lost. And so I feel like there's innumerable ways in which, you know, I guess the saying right now when someone seems to be out of touch with reality is touch grass. So it's like just go outside and experience the world. And more people have never touched grass. They've never touched dirt. They've never experienced what it's like to be around a big, powerful animal or a small, squirrely, dangerous animal or any of these things. And I think we don't realize how much we are cognitively impoverished by that lack of experience. And the same thing of you've never bucked hay, you've never wrestled, you've never swum in a creek. There's so much implicit information that we are missing that actually is actually fundamental to our world model. Yeah. That's where I think stuff like parkour and martial arts, nature connection practices, all of that is actually like a now making explicit these implicit systems of knowledge that undergird functional human beings.
So I think this is where I think it really is quite sad. So we're in a situation where we have to have these highly stylized practices to try to recreate these natural intelligences.
Yeah.
And then they become products and services, and then they get co-opted, like you said, by the whole system, and the system exacerbates the needs for more products and services. And this is how we have come to be. One of the things that I want to say is, you know, sometimes I'll do these little thought experiments with my students, and we'll be talking about, you know, collapse of civilization, X risk. You can get so everything seems quite dire. And then I'll ask people, usually young people, like, what's the little movie that's playing in your head when you think this shit's going to hit the fan, right? And like for me, and my husband and I have talked about this, we could manage to feed ourselves. We have a nice little community here. I mean, we're not going to go, you know, have the kinds of meals we have today, but in general, farming community is pretty stable. There's quite a lot of animals, you know, chickens and cows and stuff like that. We would manage, but we wouldn't be able to feed my horses. This is obvious. Like, you know, the big grain factories, there's not enough land for hay, and my horses can't do any work, so nobody would want them around. So you would eventually eat them, basically. So this is kind of like the scenario. It's just very practical, very obvious. Sometimes I get all upset because I wonder which ones I'm going to eat first, and then I get too emotional. I'm like, don't even think about that. But what happens with a lot of young people is like, I don't have the internet. I'll go back, you know, and they start thinking about like what's really dialing back to them. Like if they imagine themselves living like I grew up, like we ate mustard sandwiches on white bread, they think it's to them, this is just the end of the world. They'd rather be dead.
Yeah.
And I say to them, look, it's actually opposite. You have no idea how much pleasure and joy has been robbed from you. You have no idea how much joy is unattainable for you right now. It's just the opposite. It's not just that we'd have to go back to a horrible life. There's a certain type of life that's more embodied, more with nature, it's more alive, that comes with so many benefits. And that's to me the real tragedy, not so much, and I probably will eat my words, that things are falling apart and we're living on a precipice. To me, it's been very sad all along, because there's so many points of joy and inspiration and aliveness that have been robbed from many generations of people. And it's bad enough in, North America, and it's really bad in other parts of the world. This complete urbanization and territorialization of the population. So I I've been sad about that for a long time. And I agree with you. It's like, when I was a kid, I used to watch ants for hours. And one time I was watching an ant, and it was trying to get over this little tuft of probably dog hair or cat hair. And I was sitting there, and I kind of was transported to its kind of space-time dimension, because it had to go up this little thread and then down this, just to get from here and there, it had to go. And I was thinking, wow, that ant has no idea that it only going to get from here to there, and that the trees are really big, and above the trees is the sky. And then I was transported to this vision of a supreme being looking down at Bonnie and saying, she has no idea that. And I got this idea of, like, from a I was as far away, my view was as impoverished to this much larger view as the ants was to me. And this is just because you have quiet, focused time wondering. I kept wondering, like, where is he going? Why do they want to do that? Oh, every once in a while, there'd be a certain ant that had a limp, and and all these. I mean, and I know you agree with me. And what I want to say is, we are not talking in metaphors. We're not saying, oh, the body is like a metaphor for the mind. The mind is a metaphor for the body. I'm talking about real concrete robbery of the human possibility. I really believe that. It's been stolen from people from generations.
Yeah, I saw a thing on Twitter where someone said the smartphone cured boredom. And I thought, oh, we keep inventing these technologies and think, okay, well, they've solved this problem, and then realize that, okay, well, there's all these side effects of that solution, right? It's like, okay, horses are expensive and they poop a lot and they're not very fast. And cars solve that problem for us.
Right.
And produced cities that are atomized, and air pollution and acid rain and climate change, right? So it's like, okay, well, there's so maybe we cured boredom and we destroyed wonder and curiosity.
Yeah. And if you put a little girl on a farm with a small horse, and she spends all her time with that horse, it's not going to be more expensive than all the other things that your children want.
Yeah.
And there's something magical that can't be reproduced between a little girl and a horse, or boys and sticks in a stream. I'm not.
I take my son out to do parkour with me, and I take him out to nature, and I want him to like vault and jump and climb, and he just gets distracted with sticks all the time. And I just be like, okay, it's play. It's what he needs right now. And I gotta stop projecting my desires onto him. There's I have this idea. Well, one thing that I think that you realize when you deeply imbibe nature is how nature is built of feedback systems that actually prevent runaway processes. And I think a lot of the thinking about existential risk is built on the same template of this logical system that doesn't actually comprehend complexity well. When ChatGPT debuted, everyone was super concerned about it in the AI risk space. And John Vervaeke, our mutual friend, put out a video where he kind of set up that there's actually a lot of constraints on how intelligence operates, and it's not so easy to get outside of it. And so it won't scale nearly as fast as people were worried about. And if you look at what's happened since, right, we really haven't been able to get past ChatGPT 4.5. Nobody else has been able to even match its performance. And it kind of only works as well as it does because it's actually buffered from the craziness of the internet slightly. So there are constraints, and maybe that's too hopeful, but I think there are constraints. And one future that I imagine, what I wanted to say earlier was also, you were talking about people being concerned about what this world will look like if some of these things collapse. But I think that's also something that a lot of people are attracted to. That's why the zombie apocalypse is such a thing. It's like people actually kind of want the zombie apocalypse. They want the system to collapse because they feel like it's destroying their sense of meaning and connection. They kind of would rather live on a little farm in the middle of Pennsylvania surrounded by zombies than in a big city surrounded by zombies, right? Just different kinds of zombies. But one of the futures that I am curious about is if we're just going to destroy the internet, right? AI is not going to destroy life and everybody else. It's just going to make the internet uninhabitable for human beings because it's just going to be a bullshit machine where you can deep fake everything. And so people will just have to sort of return to systems of justification that are real and in person. And that's going to be a tragedy. It's going to hurt people a lot, but there's a way in which it might actually open a window to a world that is a lot more humane.
They have a 90-minute timer and then they start.
What's
My
that?
dogs, they have a 90-minute timer and then
Okay.
they start. Okay, I totally agree with you. I think I find some hope in this. I wouldn't know if I would bet on it, but it's like the shelf life of these things are happening really fast. Like, so chat GPT was like blah blah blah, everybody's excited, and now people think it's kind of dumb and it's kind of boring, and you just wait for the next iteration. I think artificial intelligence largely, I think what some people are making good use of it, and that is people who know how to use it to help them code. For example, they actually use it as a tool. The rest of us were all like, and I think that we're getting exhausted. I think the internet is exhausting our surprise capacity. It's everything bigger is actually more boring. So that's a good thing. And I suspect, that AI will kill the internet. What is that song? Video killed the radio show.
Yeah, radio
right?
AI killed
So yeah,
Yeah.
and I find that hopeful, and I think AI will, be around to help people design manufacturing and code and stuff like that. But then it will have been, as Ivan Illich said, a tool. You need some distance from your tool, or else you're the tool to the system. So yeah, I agree with you there. I find some hope in it.
Well, it has been 90 minutes. It went really fast. I didn't get to my second question. I'll tell you my second question. You can pick it up next time, which is how have our philosophical, religious, and scientific paradigms failed to prepare us for the type of problems that we face today?
Ah, man, that's a good one. Yeah, no, this has been lovely. It's been more like a conversation, I think, and I really enjoyed it. And I'd love to be on again and
Yeah,
look at that
absolutely.
second question. Yeah.
We'll do that. Pick that question up here in a little while. Thanks, Bonnie.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your time and your questions and for being you. I really appreciate it.
And people who want to find you, the pop-up school and
Substack pop-up school. That's the best place.
Okay, great.